Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Introduction. Visuals fade in, black and white footage of segregated water fountains, whites-only signs, and a bus where black passengers are forced to sit in the back. The screen then shifts to Martin Luther King Jr. standing before thousands, delivering his iconic words, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The crowd roars. History is in motion. Fade to black. Why was the civil rights movement necessary? For over a century after slavery ended, Black Americans were still denied their most basic rights. The Reconstruction era had promised freedom, but Jim Crow laws in the South enforced racial segregation, keeping schools, buses, restaurants, and neighborhoods divided by race. Separate but equal was a lie. Black facilities were deliberately underfunded, and Black citizens were systematically denied jobs, education, and fair treatment under the law. Voter suppression, poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation made it nearly impossible for Black Americans to vote in the South. Racial violence. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized Black communities with lynchings, bombings, and violent attacks. Economic oppression. Black workers were paid less and given fewer job opportunities, keeping many families trapped in poverty. Legalized discrimination. Laws allowed white businesses to refuse service to Black customers, and interracial marriage was illegal in many states. By the 1950s, a new generation was ready to fight back. They had seen how Black soldiers fought in World War II, only to return home to racism. They had watched as the Supreme Court ruled against segregation in Brown v. Board of Education. Yet, many Southern states refused to comply. They were done waiting. The civil rights movement wasn't just about laws. It was about dignity, justice, and the right to live as equal citizens. What this video covers, the civil rights movement wasn't just one moment. It was a series of battles, victories, and sacrifices that shaped American history. In this video, we'll dive into the Montgomery Bus Boycott, how Rosa Parks' arrest led to a year-long struggle that changed the nation. The Freedom Rides, brave activists who risked their lives to challenge segregation in the South. The March on Washington, the massive protest where MLK delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the landmark law that finally outlawed segregation and discrimination. The struggles that followed, because the fight didn't end with MLK's speech. This is the story of the movement that shook America and changed the world. Are you ready? Let's begin. The roots of racial inequality. To understand the civil rights movement, we need to go back to the moment when slavery ended, but true freedom did not come. Post-Civil War and Reconstruction. A Brief Hope, 1865 or 1877. After the Civil War, millions of formerly enslaved Black Americans were finally free. But what would freedom really mean? The federal government tried to answer this question with Reconstruction. A period, 1865-1877, meant to rebuild the South and grant equal rights to Black citizens. 3 critical amendments were passed during this time. The 13th Amendment, 1865. Abolished slavery, except as punishment for a crime, a loophole that would later be exploited. The 14th Amendment, 1868. Guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law for Black Americans. The 15th Amendment, 1870. Gave Black men the right to vote. For a brief time, Black Americans made political and economic gains. They were elected to Congress, started businesses, and built schools. But these changes triggered a violent backlash. The rise of Jim Crow, a new system of oppression, 1877-1950s. When Reconstruction ended in 1877, Southern states quickly moved to strip Black citizens of their rights. They passed Jim Crow laws enforcing strict segregation between Black and white Americans. Segregation became law. Schools, public transportation, restaurants, and even drinking fountains were divided by race. Black Americans were kept from voting. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses made sure that very few Black people could exercise their right to vote. Violence enforced white supremacy. White terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, KKK used lynchings, beatings, and arson to keep Black communities in fear. The Supreme Court legalized segregation. In Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was constitutional, even though Black facilities were almost always inferior. For nearly a century, Black Americans lived under a system designed to keep them oppressed, poor, and powerless. Early resistance and activism, 1900-1950s. Even in the darkest times, activists fought back. Black leaders and organizations laid the groundwork for what would become the Civil Rights Movement. Booker T. Washington advocated for economic advancement through education and skill building. W.E.B. Du Bois rejected Washington's approach, arguing that Black Americans needed to demand their full rights immediately. The NAACP, 1909, co-founded by Du Bois, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, used lawsuits and protests to challenge segregation. The Great Migration, 1916 to 1970, millions of Black Americans fled the South, seeking better opportunities in northern cities. These early struggles set the stage for the full-scale civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The question wasn't if change would come, it was when, and the answer was soon. Black and white footage flickers on screen. A young Black man in a crisp Brooklyn Dodgers uniform steps onto the baseball field. Fans murmur, some cheer, others jeer. Jackie Robinson adjusts his cap, eyes focused. The weight of history is on his shoulders. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first Black player in Major League Baseball, breaking the sport's color barrier. For decades, Black athletes had been banned from playing alongside white players, forced into the Negro Leagues despite their undeniable talent. But when the Brooklyn Dodgers general manager, Branch Rickey, recruited Robinson, the game, and the nation changed forever. The backlash was immediate. Fans hurled racial slurs. Some teammates refused to play with him. Opposing players spiked his legs, threw pitches at his head, and even sent him death threats. But Robinson refused to fight back. His talent did the talking. His success wasn't just about baseball. It proved to America that integration was possible. If Black and white athletes could play together, why couldn't kids go to school together? Why couldn't a nation start dismantling segregation? Cut to May 17, 1954. Inside the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Earl Warren delivers the decision in Brown v. Board of Education. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. For nearly 60 years, Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, had allowed segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. But in 1954, the Supreme Court struck it down. Segregation in schools was unconstitutional. This was a victory, but it came with a cost. White politicians in the South resisted. Some states shut down public schools entirely rather than integrate. Black students faced harassment. In 1957, the Little Rock Nine had to be escorted by federal troops just to attend an all-white school. The battle was just beginning. Brown v. Board of Education wasn't just about schools, it was a direct challenge to the entire system of segregation. It inspired Black Americans to fight harder for their rights, but white supremacists fought just as hard to keep them down. August 1955. Money, Mississippi. A 14-year-old Black boy from Chicago enters a grocery store. Emmett Till was just a kid. He had come to Mississippi to visit family. One interaction would seal his fate. A white woman, Carolyn Bryant, accused Emmett of whistling at her. Days later, her husband and his brother kidnapped Emmett, brutally beat him, shot him in the head, and threw his body into the Tallahatchie River. His mother, Mamie Till, did something unheard of. She insisted on an open casket funeral. The world saw what they did to her son. Photos of Emmett's mutilated face were published in Jet magazine, sparking national outrage. His killers were acquitted by an all-white jury after only an hour of deliberation. Months later, they admitted to the crime in a magazine interview but still walked free. Emmett's death became a turning point, galvanizing the civil rights movement. One woman, deeply moved by Emmett Till's story, would make a decision that same year that would change history. December 1st, 1955. Montgomery, Alabama. A bus pulls up to a stop. A Black woman sits in the colored section. Rosa Parks was tired, not just from work, but from years of being treated as a second-class citizen. When the driver ordered her to give up her seat for a white passenger, she refused. She was arrested. But this wasn't just about one woman on one bus. Her arrest ignited the Montgomery Bus Boycott, a massive protest where thousands of Black residents refused to ride the city's buses for over a year. One of the boycott's leaders was a 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. This movement launched him into the national spotlight as a powerful voice for nonviolent resistance. For 381 days, Black citizens walked miles instead of taking the bus. The city lost huge amounts of money as bus ridership plummeted. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled bus segregation unconstitutional. The boycott proved the power of collective action. If Black Americans could shut down a city's transportation system, what else could they achieve? The civil rights movement was no longer just an idea. It was a force of change. February 1st, 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 young Black men walk into a Woolworth's lunch counter. They sit down. The waitress refuses to serve them. They stay anyway. The Greensboro Four, Ezell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil, weren't the first to challenge segregation, but their sit-in sparked a movement. Within days, more Black students joined. Within weeks, sit-ins spread to dozens of cities. These protests were simple yet powerful. Black students would sit at whites-only counters, refusing to move until they were served. They were beaten, spat on, and arrested, but they never fought back. By summer 1960, lunch counters across the South began desegregating. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was born from these sit-ins, proving that young people would be at the forefront of the civil rights movement. May 4, 1961. A Greyhound bus leaves Washington, D.C., heading south. Black and white activists, the Freedom Riders, were testing whether the Supreme Court's ruling to desegregate interstate travel was being enforced. The deeper they went into the South, the more violent the reaction. In Alabama, a mob firebombed one of the buses. In Birmingham, Klansmen beat the riders with bats and chains. Local police looked the other way. Still, they kept going. More Freedom Riders arrived, filling jails, forcing the federal government to act. By the end of 1961, interstate bus travel was finally desegregated. But the fight wasn't over. April 1963, Birmingham, Alabama, the most segregated city in America. Martin Luther King Jr. led the Birmingham Campaign, a series of marches and boycotts targeting the city's racist policies. Police Commissioner Bull Connor responded with brutality. Fire hoses blasted children into the streets. Police dogs tore into peaceful protesters. Over 1,000 demonstrators were arrested, including King himself. From his jail cell, King wrote one of the most powerful documents in American history, Letter from Birmingham Jail. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The images from Birmingham shocked the world. The movement had never been so visible. August 28, 1963. Over 250,000 people gather at the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington for Eastside Jobs and Freedom was the largest civil rights demonstration in U.S. history, and at its climax, Dr. King stepped forward. "I have a dream." His words echoed across the National Mall, calling for racial equality, justice, and unity. The speech became immortal. But just weeks later, tragedy struck. September 15th, 1963, Birmingham, Alabama. A quiet Sunday morning at the 16th Street Baptist Church. A bomb planted by white supremacists exploded. 4 little Black girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, were killed. The world saw what racism had done. It fueled the urgency to act. July 2nd, 1964, the White House. President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act into law. Segregation in public places? Illegal. Employment discrimination? Illegal. Jim Crow? Dying. This was the biggest legislative victory in the movement so far. But one major issue remained: voting rights. March 7, 1965, Selma, Alabama. Hundreds of protesters marched toward Montgomery. As they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers attacked. Clubs, cracked skulls, tear gas filled the air. The world watched Bloody Sunday unfold on live television. The horror led to action. March 21st of the 25, 1965. Thousands complete the Selma to Montgomery March. August 6, 1965. The Voting Rights Act is signed into law. This law banned literacy tests, poll taxes, and voter suppression tactics. By 1965, the movement had won major victories. But the fight wasn't over. The struggle for true equality would continue. The Black Panther Party, BPP, founded in 1966, in Oakland, California, by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, emerged during a time of intense racial injustice and police brutality. While the civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., focused on nonviolent resistance, the Black Panthers took a radically different approach: armed self-defense and community empowerment. Origins and philosophy. The Black Panther Party was deeply influenced by Malcolm X, who had promoted self-defense and Black nationalism before his assassination in 1965. Newton and Seale believed that passive resistance was not enough. Black people had the right to defend themselves against systemic oppression, particularly from the police. Armed patrols and confronting police brutality. One of the Panthers' most controversial and well-known actions was their armed patrols of Black neighborhoods. Under California law at the time, it was legal to carry firearms in public as long as they were not concealed. The Panthers used this to their advantage. They followed police cars to monitor arrests of Black citizens, ensuring that officers did not abuse their power. If police stopped a Black person, Panthers would stand at a legal distance, holding their weapons in plain sight, reminding both the officers and the community that they were watching. Their presence sent a clear message. Black communities would no longer tolerate unchecked police violence. This tactic was called policing the police. It gained national attention, especially after dramatic public confrontations between the Panthers and law enforcement. Confrontation with the government, local, and federal authorities saw the Panthers as a major threat. Their willingness to openly carry guns and challenge law enforcement directly was unheard of at the time. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, labeled them the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. Through COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, the FBI infiltrated the Black Panther Party with undercover agents, spread misinformation, causing internal divisions, arrested and assassinated key leaders, including Fred Hampton in 1969, who was shot in his sleep during an FBI raid in Chicago. This aggressive campaign severely weakened the organization, leading to its eventual decline in the 1970s. Beyond the guns, social programs. Despite their militant image, the Panthers were much more than an armed resistance group. Their survival programs focused on helping impoverished Black communities, filling gaps left by government neglect. Free breakfast program for children. One of their most successful initiatives was the Free Breakfast for School Children program. By 1969, the Panthers were feeding thousands of children every morning in cities across the U.S. This program highlighted the economic inequality that many Black families faced. It was so effective that the U.S. government later implemented a national free breakfast program inspired by the Panthers model. Health clinics and education. The Panthers also established free medical clinics in Black neighborhoods to provide health care for those who couldn't afford it. Education programs that taught Black history and political awareness, countering the Eurocentric narrative taught in schools. These programs embodied the Panthers' philosophy: empower Black communities to be self-sufficient. Heroes or threats. The Black Panther Party was deeply polarizing. To the U.S. government and white mainstream America, they were seen as dangerous revolutionaries, a group that threatened the status quo. But to many in the Black community, they were heroes, people who stood up against oppression, provided real solutions to poverty and police violence, and fought for dignity and equality. Even though the Black Panther Party eventually declined due to internal conflicts and government repression, their legacy still influences activism today. Groups like Black Lives Matter and movements advocating for racial justice have drawn inspiration from the Panthers' message of self-defense, empowerment, and systemic change. Thurgood Marshall, a trailblazer for civil rights and justice on October 2, 1967, Thurgood Marshall made history by becoming the first Black Supreme Court justice in the United States. His appointment was more than just a personal achievement. It was a monumental step for civil rights, proving that African Americans could reach the highest levels of the legal system. However, his journey to the Supreme Court was not easy, and his legacy is a testament to the ongoing struggle for racial equality and justice. Early life and legal career. Born in 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland, Marshall grew up in the segregated South, where Black Americans faced severe discrimination in all aspects of life. His father, William Marshall, instilled in him a love for debate and law, often taking him to watch court trials. This exposure shaped his future as a lawyer and activist. Marshall attended Howard University School of Law, where he studied under Charles Hamilton Houston, a legal genius who laid the foundation for dismantling segregation in the U.S. legal system. Under Houston's mentorship, Marshall became deeply committed to using the law to challenge racial injustice. Winning Brown v. Board of Education. Before joining the Supreme Court, Marshall made his mark as the lead attorney for the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. His most famous case was Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, where he successfully argued that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The case overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, which had established the separate but equal doctrine. The Supreme Court's decision in Brown outlawed segregation in schools, setting a legal precedent for dismantling segregation in all areas of society. It was one of the most significant victories in the civil rights movement, proving that the law could be used to achieve racial justice. Marshall's legal brilliance and persistence in fighting for civil rights caught the attention of national leaders, leading to his eventual nomination to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court appointment, a historic first in 1967, President Lyndon B. Johnson nominated Marshall to the Supreme Court, making him the first Black justice in American history. Johnson, a supporter of civil rights, believed that Marshall's presence on the court would help advance racial equality. His confirmation was met with intense opposition from Southern segregationists in the Senate, who saw his appointment as a threat to the status quo. Despite this, Marshall was confirmed, marking a symbolic and legal victory for the civil rights movement. Defender of civil rights and the Constitution, as a Supreme Court justice, Marshall became a champion for the rights of marginalized people. Throughout his 24-year tenure, 1967-1991, he consistently defended civil rights and equal protection. Marshall was a strong advocate for racial justice, ensuring that laws were applied fairly to all citizens, regardless of race. He opposed the death penalty, arguing that it was disproportionately used against Black defendants. He supported affirmative action, believing it was necessary to correct historical injustices caused by racism. Voting rights. Marshall fought to protect the right to vote for African Americans, who had historically been disenfranchised by poll taxes, literacy tests, and voter suppression laws. He supported striking down discriminatory voting laws, ensuring that Black citizens had a voice in democracy. Workers' rights and economic justice. Marshall believed that the law should protect workers, the poor, and the vulnerable. He ruled in favor of strong labor laws, fair wages, and workplace protections. He believed the government had a role in helping disadvantaged communities rise out of poverty. Symbol of Black excellence and the fragility of progress. Thurgood Marshall's appointment was a symbol of Black excellence in the legal system. He broke racial barriers and paved the way for future generations of Black lawyers, judges, and policymakers. However, his legacy also serves as a reminder that progress is not guaranteed. His retirement in 1991 led to the appointment of Clarence Thomas, whose judicial philosophy was vastly different from Marshall's. The struggle for civil rights, voting rights, and economic justice continues today, showing that Marshall's fight is far from over. Conclusion. Thurgood Marshall's impact on American history is immeasurable. As a lawyer, he changed the course of civil rights with cases like Brown v. Board of Education. As a Supreme Court justice, he protected the rights of the most vulnerable in society. His appointment was proof that change was happening, but his legacy reminds us that progress requires constant vigilance and effort. April 4, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee. The Lorraine Motel. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the balcony speaking with friends. Seconds later, a gunshot rang out. King fell. The leader of nonviolent resistance, the man who had inspired millions, was assassinated. The news shattered the country. Riots erupted in over 100 cities. Fires burned. Protests turned into violent uprisings. America felt like it was on the brink of chaos. Less than a week later, Congress acted April 11, 1968, the White House. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act, banning discrimination in housing based on race, religion, or national origin. Black families could no longer be denied homes in white neighborhoods. Banks couldn't legally refuse loans just because of race. Segregated housing policies began to crumble. This was one of the final major legislative victories of the civil rights movement. But with King gone and the country divided, a new chapter of the fight for justice was just beginning. The civil rights movement didn't just change laws, it changed the soul of America. The fight for desegregation, voting rights, and racial equality left a permanent mark on the country. The victories of the 1960s paved the way for a more inclusive society, but they also revealed that the struggle for justice was far from over. What changed? Education. Schools were no longer legally segregated, allowing future generations of Black children greater opportunities. Politics. Black leaders gained a stronger voice. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act opened doors to Black politicians, leading to historic moments like the election of Barack Obama as the first Black U.S. president in 2008. Modern struggles. The fight continues. Despite the civil rights movement's victories, racism never vanished. It evolved. Voter suppression. While the 1965 Voting Rights Act ended literacy tests and poll taxes, new barriers emerged. Gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and polling place closures continue to disproportionately affect Black communities. Police brutality. The same fight against racial violence that fueled protests in the 1960s resurfaced in the 21st century. The deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd ignited the Black Lives Matter movement, BLM, a modern-day call for justice echoing the cries of the past. Economic inequality. Black communities still face disparities in wealth, housing, and job opportunities, a lasting impact of centuries of discrimination. History has shown that progress is never automatic. It must be fought for. The call to why. Action. The civil rights movement wasn't just about Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, or Malcolm X. It was about ordinary people making extraordinary change. Young people stood at the front lines then, and they still do today. Change didn't happen because politicians wanted it. It happened because the people demanded it. The lessons of the past remind us that history isn't something we just remember, it's something we build upon. The fight for justice, equality, and civil rights didn't end in the 1960s. It continues today. Will we stand up, speak out, and push forward, just as they did? The civil rights movement was more than a moment in history. It was a transformation. It shattered segregation, secured voting rights, and gave a voice to the voiceless. But it also revealed how deep injustice runs and how the fight for equality never truly ends. We've come far, but we're not done. Black leaders now hold positions of power once thought impossible. Activists continue the fight for justice, inspired by those who marched before them. The movement's lessons live on, reminding us that change happens when people refuse to stay silent. The civil rights movement didn't just change America, it challenged America to be better, and that challenge is still with us today. If you found this history important, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation in the comments. What lessons do you think we still need to learn? Let's keep the discussion going.